Hungry, old man? I'll give you my black card if you lift these sacks.
I'll give you my black card if you lift these bags. Richard Coleman's voice thundered across the construction site, his laughter echoing off the half-finished steel and glass. Workers paused, leaning on their shovels. Two women in sleek black dresses smirked behind him, their eyes fixed on the old man standing in the dust. George Miller's clothes were torn, his beard thick and unkempt, his hands trembling not from weakness, but from hunger. He had only asked for a plate of food. Instead, he found himself ridiculed, with a dozen eyes burning into him, expecting him to bow his head and walk away. Richard dangled the black card like bait, his grin sharp as a knife. The small group burst into laughter, convinced the frail figure before them couldn't even touch a single cement bag, much less lift one. But George didn't lower his gaze, his eyes, steel grey, carrying stories no one there knew, fixed on Richard's smirk. And in that silent stare, something shifted, though no one could name it yet. What would follow left an entire construction site speechless. Before we begin this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city you are watching, and don't forget to leave your like to keep following us. Richard Coleman stood tall in his grey suit, the sunlight bouncing off the polished steel of the unfinished building behind him. His hard hat sat slightly tilted, more like an accessory than safety gear. In his hand, the black card gleamed between his fingers, lifted high as if it were a royal decree. He chuckled, tapping it twice against his palm, savoring the silence he had created before the laughter started again. George Miller shifted uncomfortably, the strap of his worn backpack digging into his shoulder. The dust on his boots rose each time he moved, and his shirt, once blue, had long faded to grey. His ribs pressed against the thin fabric with every shallow breath. He hadn't come here for humiliation. He had come because his stomach ached with hunger, and the scent of fried food from the workers' lunchboxes had been too much to ignore. Yet here he was, the center of a cruel joke. "Come on, old man," Richard said, his voice rich with mockery. "These bags weigh more than you, but hey," he waved the card like a magician revealing a trick. "If you make it happen, this little piece of plastic is yours. Imagine what doors it could open for you." His teeth flashed white, perfect, predatory. The workers leaned on their shovels, exchanging glances. Jack, the youngest among them, whispered to Michael, "He'll never even touch it." Michael smirked, eyes never leaving the frail figure standing in the dirt. Olivia, one of the women behind Richard, folded her arms tightly, tilting her head with a mixture of pity and disdain. Chloe, in contrast, nudged her friend's elbow, whispering something that made them both giggle. George's hands tightened into fists, veins rising against weathered skin. His silence was heavy, more powerful than any insult he could have thrown back. Slowly, he stepped closer to the pile of cement bags. Dust clung to his trousers, the knees frayed from years of wear. His movements were cautious, but there was something deliberate in the way he closed the distance, something that didn't match the image of a broken man. Richard clapped, the sound sharp and mocking. "That's the spirit. Let's give him a chance, shall we?" His voice rose, commanding attention. "Gentlemen, ladies, watch closely. History is about to be made or broken." The group chuckled again, some shaking their heads, others already looking away, certain this would end in nothing but embarrassment. Yet George stopped just a step away from the pile. His shadow fell across the cement bags, his breath steadying as his hand hovered in the air. His eyes narrowed, focused not on the laughter around him, but on the challenge before him. The sight grew quiet, the anticipation thick, as his hand inched closer to the rough surface of the first bag. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, pretending to grow impatient, though the grin never left his face. "All right, let's make it official," he declared, his voice booming like an auctioneer's. "You lift one of those cement bags off the ground, high enough for everyone here to see, and this card," he held it up again, gleaming under the sun, "is yours. No tricks, no takebacks." He slipped the card into his breast pocket with exaggerated care, tapping it twice as if locking away treasure. George's gaze followed the motion but gave no sign of desire. His expression was unreadable, the kind of calm that unsettled even the confident. Richard leaned closer, lowering his tone but not the cruelty. "But if you fail, old man, you walk away, no food, no pity, nothing. You disappear. Deal?" The workers shifted uneasily. Some found the spectacle amusing, but others avoided looking directly at George, as though ashamed by the imbalance of power on display. Jack muttered under his breath, "This isn't right." Michael shot him a warning glance. "Keep your mouth shut. You want to lose your job?" Olivia tilted her head, studying George more carefully now. There was something in his posture, the way his shoulders squared as if carrying invisible weight. Chloe smirked, whispering, "He won't even get his fingers under it." But Olivia didn't respond this time. Her eyes lingered on George's hands, scarred strong despite the dirt and tremble. George bent slowly, his knees creaking as he lowered himself toward the pile. A hush fell across the group. The ridges of the cement bags pressed against his fingertips as he let them rest there, testing the weight, the texture, the familiarity. For a fleeting second, his lips parted, as though remembering something no one else could see. Richard's laughter broke the silence. "Look at him. He can't even decide where to start. Don't strain yourself, Grandpa." He gestured toward the women, drawing fresh giggles. "Maybe he just wants a closer look before he passes out." But George didn't look up. He pressed his palm flat against the rough surface, steadying himself, inhaling deeply. His chest expanded, slow and deliberate, and when he exhaled, it wasn't the sigh of defeat. It was the breath of someone preparing. The air grew tense, every eye fixed on the old man crouched before the cement bags. Something about the stillness, the way his muscles tightened beneath his thin shirt, hinted that this wouldn't unfold the way Richard expected. George's knees cracked as he steadied himself in front of the pile, the dusty earth shifting under his boots. He placed both hands on the rough surface of the cement bag, fingers tracing the worn burlap, as though reacquainting himself with an old adversary. His breathing slowed, deeper now, almost rhythmic. To the onlookers, it seemed like hesitation, weakness. But beneath that calm exterior was the flicker of memory, the shadow of a man who had once commanded arenas instead of pity. Richard folded his arms, watching closely, his grin widening with every second of silence. "Careful there," he sneered, tilting his head toward Chloe and Olivia. "This could be the most exercise he's had in years." Chloe chuckled, covering her mouth, while Olivia's eyes lingered, not laughing this time. Something about George's composure gnawed at her, though she couldn't yet name it. Jack shifted uncomfortably, muttering, "Why's he taking so long?" Michael smirked, whispering back, "Because he's about to break in half." Their words carried farther than they thought, and George heard them, but he didn't flinch. He pressed down against the coarse fabric, testing the weight with his palms, letting the resistance travel up through his arms into his shoulders, reminding muscles long dormant what it felt like to awaken. Then came the first movement. He curled his fingers under the edge of the bag, slow, deliberate. The veins in his forearms tightened like old ropes pulled taut. The laughter swelled again, soft at first, then louder, as Richard's voice cut through. "Ladies and gentlemen, the suspense is unbearable. Will our champion of the sidewalk lift a single pound today?" George tugged, the bag shifting just slightly, maybe an inch off the ground before dropping back with a thud. Dust clouded the air, and the laughter doubled. Chloe clapped mockingly, her bracelets jingling with each exaggerated cheer. "Oh, so close," she jeered. "Someone give him a medal for effort." But Olivia's eyes narrowed. She had caught it, the brief lift, the fraction of a second when the bag had left the ground. Most of the others missed it, too busy laughing, but she saw the control in his grip, the way his back straightened, the subtle tightening of his jaw. That wasn't a feeble tug. That was testing, measuring. George wiped his palms against his trousers, leaving faint streaks of dust. His lips moved slightly as though whispering to himself, but no sound reached the others. He crouched lower, repositioned his feet, and placed his hands again, this time gripping with intention. Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing for the first time. Something in George's stance looked different now, balanced, precise, purposeful. The mocking smile faltered for a split second before he caught himself. "Don't hurt yourself, old man," he called, masking the flicker of doubt with bravado. "Wouldn't want to waste what's left of you." George ignored him. He closed his eyes, inhaled slowly, and tightened his grip. For a moment, time seemed to pause. The voices, the laughter, even the distant rumble of trucks on the street faded. There was only the bag beneath his fingers, and the memory of what strength once felt like. His body leaned into the motion, and this time, the cement bag didn't just budge. It began to rise. The small group fell silent mid-laugh, the air thick with disbelief as the rough sack lifted higher, steady in George's grasp. The bag rose higher in George's grip, the coarse fabric stretching against his fingers as he drew it upward with a steadiness that silenced the chuckles around him. Dust trickled down his shirt, clinging to the sweat beginning to bead at his temple. His thin frame trembled, but not with frailty. With the raw effort of a man reconnecting with something buried deep inside him. The workers froze. Jack's mouth parted, his shovel slipping from his hand into the dirt. Michael blinked, the smirk wiped clean from his face. Olivia's lips parted in disbelief, her brows drawing together as if trying to reconcile what she was seeing with the image she had built in her mind moments earlier. Chloe, however, scoffed nervously, crossing her arms tighter. "It's just adrenaline," she muttered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Richard's smile faltered as the sack cleared George's knees, then his waist, until it hung against his chest, steady and secure. The CEO's laughter died in his throat, leaving only the sound of the city, the hammering from the construction site, the distant horns from passing traffic. For the first time, he had no clever line to toss into the air. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing at the sight of a man he had expected to crumble standing tall under the weight. George adjusted his stance, spreading his feet wider, his back straight as he balanced the bag. His arms locked with practiced form, and though his body trembled, his grip was sure unshaken. The years of hunger and hardship hadn't stripped away the foundation of strength that once defined him. With a grunt, he shifted the sack higher until it rested securely on his shoulder. The sight erupted, not in laughter but in gasps. Jack clapped his hand over his mouth, unable to contain the awe. Michael exhaled sharply, whispering, "No way." Olivia's eyes glistened, caught between shock and respect, while Chloe forced a nervous laugh, though no one joined her this time. Richard stepped forward, his shoes crunching over gravel. He tried to mask his unease with bravado. "All right," he said, his voice louder than necessary. "So he can lift one. Congratulations, old man. You want a medal?" His laugh came late, hollow, echoing against the steel beams without conviction. George didn't answer. He held the bag a few seconds longer, then lowered it gently back to the pile, the thud shaking the dust loose into the air. He straightened slowly, wiping his brow with the back of his sleeve. His chest rose and fell heavily, but his eyes never wavered from Richard's. Silence settled like a blanket. The group looked between the two men, sensing a shift they couldn't quite articulate. Richard had staged this moment for entertainment, for humiliation, yet here he stood, confronted with something that made his power feel suddenly fragile. George finally broke the silence, his voice rough, gravelly but firm. "You wanted to see if I could lift it," he said, his gaze locked on Richard. "Now you've seen." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavier than the cement bag itself. The onlookers waited for Richard's next move, their eyes shifting back to him. Would he honor his word or twist the game to save his pride? Richard's jaw flexed as he adjusted his tie, the silence pressing down heavier than the cement bag George had just lifted. The laughter he had orchestrated minutes ago had dissolved into an uneasy quiet, eyes darting between him and the old man, who still stood tall, his chest heaving, his gaze unflinching. For Richard, silence was dangerous. Silence meant people were thinking, and thinking was the first step to questioning. He clapped suddenly, the sound sharp and hollow. "Impressive," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Truly, I underestimated you. But," he drew out the word like a blade, pacing in front of the group, "anyone can have a lucky moment. Adrenaline, desperation, it makes men do strange things." His eyes flicked to George, narrowing with challenge. "The real question is, can you do it again?" Olivia stiffened. "Richard, that's enough," she said quietly, but he ignored her. Chloe, eager to rejoin his side, smirked and added, "Yes, let's see if it wasn't just a fluke." The workers murmured uneasily, shifting on their feet. Jack muttered, "He already proved it." Michael whispered back, "Don't say a word, just watch." Richard raised his voice, cutting through the murmurs. "Here's the new deal," he announced, holding the black card between two fingers like a prize at an auction. Not one, but 2 bags. At the same time. He gestured grandly toward the pile, the cement dust swirling around his polished shoes. "Lift them both, old man, and I'll hand you this card myself. Fail." He paused, savoring the tension. "And everyone here will know today you've wasted the last of your strength chasing a dream you'll never catch." Gasps rippled through the group. Even Chloe's smirk faltered for a moment, though she quickly masked it with folded arms. Olivia shook her head, whispering under her breath, "This is cruelty." But her voice was too soft for Richard to hear. George's face remained unreadable. His chest still rose and fell from the effort of the first lift, but his eyes, those cold steel eyes, didn't waver. He glanced at the pile, at the 2 bags stacked beside each other, their combined weight nearly double what he had just carried. His hand brushed his beard, and for a fleeting moment his gaze drifted, not to the cement, not to Richard, but somewhere far away. A memory flickered behind his eyes, a younger George standing beneath blinding stadium lights, sweat running down his temples as a roaring crowd chanted his name. The barbell above his head had weighed more than any cement bag, yet his arms had locked, steady as stone. For a second, the phantom roar echoed in his ears, mixing with the faint hum of the city. Richard mistook the silence for hesitation. He leaned in, his smirk returning like a mask. "What's the matter, George? Too much for you. You can walk away now. No shame in knowing your limits." His voice dripped with false mercy, but the glint in his eye betrayed the hunger to see the man fail. George bent slowly, his knees cracking as he approached the 2 bags. His hands brushed over the rough surfaces, testing the balance. The crowd leaned closer, breaths held tight. The air buzzed with anticipation, heavier now than the sacks themselves. And then, without a word, George planted his feet firmly in the dirt, lowering his body into position. The silence deepened, broken only by the sound of his steady breathing as his fingers curled under the first bag. Then the second. George's fingers curled around the rough edges of the cement bags, his knuckles whitening as he adjusted his stance. The weight bit into his hands before he had even lifted, but there was no tremor of fear in his eyes. His breath came steady, deep, like a diver filling his lungs before plunging into dark waters. The silence around him thickened, every cough, every shuffle of boots in the gravel, every nervous chuckle cut off mid-sound. He pulled slowly, the muscles in his forearms taut, the veins rising against paper-thin skin. His arms shook not with weakness, but with resistance, as though his body was waking from a long slumber. His shirt stretched across his shoulders, revealing the framework of a man built by discipline and endurance, not just brute force. And then it happened. The first bag broke free from the ground, lifting a few inches. The second followed slower, stubborn but rising all the same. A chorus of gasps erupted. Chloe's hand shot to her mouth, eyes wide now with disbelief instead of mockery. Jack muttered, He's really doing it." Michael shook his head, whispering, "That's not possible at his age." But Olivia didn't look shocked. She looked transfixed. Her eyes softened, recognition dawning in the smallest details. The stance, the precision, the calm breathing between bursts of strain. She had seen something like it before, years ago, on a television screen while flipping through channels late at night. A man on a podium, his arms raised high, lifting weights that seemed inhuman. The crowd behind him had roared, a sea of flags and flashing cameras. She whispered almost to herself, "George? Miller?" The name hung in the air like a fragile secret. Richard snapped his head toward her. "What did you say?" Olivia swallowed, her eyes still locked on George, who now had both bags several inches off the ground, his body trembling but holding steady. "George Miller," she repeated louder this time. "He was an athlete, a champion years ago. He was on the national team. He broke records. I remember..." Her voice faltered, heavy with realization. The workers exchanged glances, the pieces falling into place. Jack whispered, "No way. That's him." Michael frowned, uncertain. "I think I saw his name once. He vanished after something happened." Richard's smirk faltered. He turned back to George, studying him with new eyes, searching for cracks in the image he had painted of a frail old beggar. But the more he looked, the more he saw it. the posture of a trained lifter, the deliberate control, the quiet defiance. George's face tightened, sweat rolling down his temple. Memories collided with the present, the roar of the crowd, the smell of chalk on his hands, the blinding flash of cameras. And then, the quiet hospital room where his wife had lain pale and weak, the machines humming around her, every dollar he had ever earned slipping away into a losing battle. His arms locked, the bags rising until both rested against his thighs, suspended by sheer will. His body trembled violently now, but his eyes stayed forward, fixed not on Richard, not on the black card, but on some invisible horizon only he could see. The group stood frozen, caught between disbelief and awe, as the man they had mocked revealed a piece of who he truly was. The air around the construction site felt charged, like the seconds before a thunderstorm breaks. George's arms trembled, the cement bags straining against his grip, yet his stance held. His boots dug into the gravel, anchoring him like roots. Every muscle in his body screamed, but his eyes stayed sharp, unyielding. Richard watched, frozen in place. His usual smirk had vanished, replaced by a furrowed brow and lips pressed thin. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. For once, his voice failed him. "Come on, old man," Michael whispered, though there was no mockery now. Jack gripped the handle of his shovel, eyes wide, whispering back, "He's not gonna let go. Look at him." Even Chloe, who had been so quick to laugh, stood pale and silent, her arms crossed tightly, nails digging into her skin. Olivia's eyes shone, her lips parting as if she were silently cheering him on. George inhaled deeply, filling his chest one last time. With a guttural sound torn from somewhere deep in his chest, he tightened his grip and pulled higher. The bags rose, slow but steady, until they cleared his waist, then his chest, and finally, against all odds, rested on his broad, quivering shoulders. The silence shattered. Gasps, exclamations, disbelief filled the sight. A worker dropped his helmet with a metallic clang. Olivia brought her hand to her mouth, eyes watering with awe. Jack let out a yell, clapping his hands together. Even Michael, usually so cynical, could only shake his head, muttering, "Unbelievable." George stood tall beneath the crushing weight, his knees bent slightly but his back straight, his jaw clenched with iron will. His shirt clung to him, soaked with sweat, but his grip didn't falter. In that moment, he wasn't a beggar, wasn't a man worn by tragedy. He was what he had always been, a lifter, a giant in spirit, carrying not just cement, but the remnants of a life defined by resilience. Richard took a step back, his polished shoes grinding against the dust. His face flushed red, then pale. He glanced around, desperate to see if anyone still laughed, if anyone still followed his lead. But every eye was locked on George, admiration replacing mockery. For Richard, it was worse than defeat. It was irrelevance. George held the bags a few seconds longer, the veins in his arms bulging like cords of steel. Then, with slow precision, he lowered them back to the ground, controlling the descent until the sacks landed with a deep thud that echoed across the steel beams. He straightened again, his chest heaving, his body trembling but his eyes burning with quiet triumph. No one laughed now. The silence was different, thick with respect, with the realization that they had just witnessed something impossible. The man they had mocked had become untouchable before their eyes, and Richard, once the loudest voice, now stood mute, his black card still clutched in his hand, useless, meaningless. The thud of the cement bags still reverberated through the ground, as though the earth itself carried the echo of George's triumph. Dust floated lazily in the air, illuminated by the late afternoon sun slanting between steel beams. Every pair of eyes on the site remained fixed on the old man, who now stood with his shoulders drawn back, his chest rising and falling like a tide, sweat glistening down the lines of his face. No one spoke, not a cough, not a whisper. It was the kind of silence that follows a miracle, a silence charged with reverence and disbelief. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his polished loafers scraping against the gravel. His hand twitched at his pocket, where the black card still rested. He had wielded it moments ago like a weapon, a symbol of untouchable status. Now it weighed on him like an anchor, burning against his chest. His mouth opened, but no words came. Jack broke the quiet first. He let out a low whistle, shaking his head. That was insane. His voice carried, cutting through the stillness. Michael nodded slowly, still wide-eyed, his cynicism shattered. He wasn't just lifting, he said, he was proving something. Chloe tried to laugh, the sound brittle and hollow. Well, good for him, she muttered, but the attempt only drew her isolation deeper. Olivia turned sharply, her eyes narrowing, and Chloe swallowed her words, falling silent. Olivia stepped forward, her heels crunching over the dust. She looked at George, not with pity this time, but with awe. Her voice trembled when she spoke, soft but steady. You were George Miller, the lifter. I remember watching you on TV. You were a champion. George's grey eyes met hers, calm, unwavering. He said nothing, but the smallest nod confirmed her words. A ripple went through the group, recognition dawning, respect rising like a tide. The workers who had laughed now stood straighter, their gazes heavy with shame for having mocked a man whose shoulders once bore the pride of a nation. Richard felt it, that shift in power. His chest tightened as he looked around, his audience no longer laughing at the old man, but judging him instead. Their silence wasn't aimed at George anymore. It was aimed at him. For the first time in years, Richard Coleman, the millionaire CEO, the man who commanded boardrooms and bulldozers alike, found himself speechless. His throat burned, but no sound came out. His smirk had died, replaced by the hollow look of a man exposed. George wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his voice low, steady when he finally spoke. I didn't ask for your card. I asked for food. His words cut sharper than any roar could. Richard's lips trembled, his fingers tightening on the card in his pocket. Everyone waited. Would he step forward and honor his word, or would he shrink under the weight of his own cruelty? The silence pressed heavier than the cement bags ever had. The tension that gripped the sight finally broke. Not with laughter this time, but with applause. It began hesitantly, Jack slapping his calloused palms together, his eyes still wide with awe. Then Michael joined in, the sound firmer, more certain. Within seconds, the workers echoed them, their voices rising, whistles and cheers filling the air where mockery had lived moments ago. George stood still, his hands loose at his sides, his body tired but unbowed. The ovation was not for a spectacle, not for a trick, but for dignity, for a man who had been reduced to dust in the eyes of the world, yet still carried a strength they couldn't deny. The workers who had laughed earlier now found themselves clapping the hardest, as if their applause could erase their guilt. Olivia's eyes shone with tears she didn't try to hide. She stepped closer to George, her voice barely audible over the noise. They'll remember this, Mr. Miller. Not who you became, but who you still are. Chloe shifted nervously, her arms folded tight, her face pale. She tried to stay behind Richard, but even her posture betrayed discomfort. She dared not meet George's gaze. And Richard. Richard stood alone in the center of the storm. His black card still in his hand, pinched so tightly his knuckles whitened, but no one cared to look at it anymore. The power it had symbolized moments before had dissolved. No one's eyes followed the card. They were locked on George, the man Richard had tried to turn into a joke, who now towered over him without moving an inch. The CEO felt the stares digging into him, heavy and merciless. He heard the whispers traveling through the crowd, the murmur of his own employees questioning the man they had once feared. He adjusted his cufflinks out of habit, but the gesture looked empty, desperate. For the first time, Richard Coleman, the untouchable millionaire, felt small. George turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting Richard's. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The silence that followed the applause told everyone who had won this confrontation. The black card in Richard's hand was meaningless now. Against the weight of respect, money had no value. Richard licked his lips, his throat dry. He forced a smile, but it faltered under George's steady stare. He opened his mouth to speak, but Olivia's voice cut across the silence, sharp and clear. So you mocked a man who's carried more weight in his life than you ever will, Richard. Look at him, and look at yourself. The words landed like a verdict. The workers nodded, their applause softening into murmurs of agreement. Richard's face burned crimson, his shoulders slumping ever so slightly. George finally broke the gaze, not with triumph, but with a quiet dignity. He turned toward the workers, nodding once in gratitude for their cheers. For him, their respect meant more than any card or fortune could. Richard, card in hand, now stood in the dust and shadows, smaller than the man he had tried to humiliate. The sight had quieted again, the echoes of applause fading into the stillness of late afternoon. George remained standing, his shoulders relaxed now, the storm of effort behind him. The cement bags lay where he had placed them, like defeated sentinels, while the workers watched him with a respect they hadn't shown anyone in years, not even Richard. Richard tried to regain composure, slipping the black card back into his pocket, but no one's eyes followed him. He was invisible now, reduced to the background of a story no longer his. Olivia, however, stepped forward, her voice steady, yet tender. "George, what happened to you?" The old man's gaze drifted beyond the unfinished skyscraper, beyond the dust and noise, as if staring into a memory etched across the horizon. His voice, when it came, was low, rough, yet each word carried weight. "I had everything once. Crowds cheering my name, medals shining around my neck. But glory doesn't last, my wife." His throat tightened and he paused. The workers leaned in, silent. "She fell ill. The treatments were endless. Every trophy I had ever earned meant nothing compared to keeping her alive. I sold everything, spent everything, and when she was gone..." His words trailed off into the thick air. A hush hung heavier than any applause. Even Chloe, usually ready with a smirk, lowered her gaze, shame burning across her face. Jack swallowed hard, whispering to no one in particular. He lost everything for love. George straightened, his eyes meeting theirs again, steady and proud. "I may have lost my home, my savings, my place in the world, but I never lost my strength, not here." He tapped his chest with 2 fingers, firm, "and not here." His hand shifted to his temple. Olivia's eyes filled, a tear sliding freely down her cheek. Michael looked away, blinking rapidly. Even Richard, though his face remained hard, couldn't mask the flicker of guilt that crossed his expression. George finally allowed himself a tired smile, faint but warm. "I didn't need his card. I only needed a meal." But now, he gestured to the workers, to Olivia, to the silent crowd that had once mocked him. "I see I've reminded you, and myself, that dignity doesn't vanish just because fortune does." The workers erupted again, but this time not with wild applause. It was softer, more reverent, a collective nod to the truth they had just witnessed. Some clapped slowly, others simply bowed their heads in respect. Richard remained still, his body heavy with the realization that all his wealth, his card, his arrogance, none of it had commanded the respect George had earned in minutes. George turned to leave, his steps slow but purposeful. He hadn't taken the card, hadn't asked for pity. He had given them something greater than a performance. He had given them a memory, a reminder of the invisible strength that no humiliation could ever erase. And as he disappeared beyond the gates of the construction site, every soul there knew they would never forget, the day the so-called beggar showed them who the real giant was. George walked away without riches, without applause echoing in arenas, but with something that neither time nor tragedy could take from him, his dignity. In the dust of a construction site, he proved that true greatness is not measured by black cards or skyscrapers, but by the weight a soul can carry when stripped of everything else. Richard stood behind, diminished, clutching a piece of plastic that suddenly felt like nothing. His silence was louder than all his past boasts, a reminder that arrogance crumbles in the face of quiet strength. The workers, the women, everyone who had witnessed that moment would carry it with them, the day a homeless man revealed what no fortune could ever buy. And perhaps that was the greatest gift George had given them, not the sight of a man lifting cement, but the memory of a heart lifting something heavier, the invisible burden of love, loss, and unbroken spirit. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heart-touching story. Tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Subscribe and turn on the bell to receive more stories that inspire and transform. Leave a like if you believe in the invisible strength of dignity and family. And above all, thank you for being part of this community that believes in stories with soul. And before you go, watch the story I leave here on the left. I'm sure it will also move you and make you reflect.